This is John Eichten. I'm Minute Services Deputy Commissioner. Thanks for the opportunity to join everybody today. One of the great things about working at Minute that I've always appreciated in my time at Minute is you get to connect with every agency. You get to learn a little bit about the work that every agency does to serve the people of Minnesota. And the Department of Revenue is out front on a lot of these issues due to their numerous public-facing materials and their direct work with the public, everything from tax documents to information on how to gain access to your personal data. So it's just great to have a chance to talk with Tori and get behind the scenes about what they do to ensure equitable access to e-learning and online training. So welcome to the Global Accessibility Awareness Day show, Tori.
Thank you, John, and it's great to be here.
Great to have you. So if we can just start out first with like a little background, can you tell us all a little bit about the kind of training materials you develop for DOR and who's it for?
Sure, I'd love to. So, at the Department of Revenue, we develop training materials for both state employees and our external customers, the taxpayers of Minnesota. Some of our training is part of a certification that the Department of Revenue offers. For example, our property tax calculation exam. Others are informational trainings that are part of our division new hire programs or power of attorney training for employees. We also develop compliance training, like our annual required training, for example. Our trainings can be found on the Department of Revenue public website, on internal SharePoint sites, and on ELM, our learning management system.
Great. So let me ask, was there any particular event or need that caused you to engage in this accessibility project? Was there a particular challenge, like with a piece of software that you had to solve, or what was the kind of genesis of this work?
Sure. So the accessibility project at the Department of Revenue wasn't necessarily a reaction to one particular thing or software challenge. Um, our efforts in our accessibility project actually precede my joining of the agency. The creation of my position was actually a result of our accessible e-learning project. Um, the initial dive into creating accessible e-learning was kind of a twofold thing. The first piece stems from an awareness that accessibility is very important, and we had the desire to be proactive about accessibility. The other side is that as a state agency, we have a legal requirement to comply with the state's accessibility standard, and we weren't confident that we were doing everything we could to make our training accessible, or even how to determine if the steps that were being taken were effective. However, once we finally started down our accessible e-learning path in earnest, everyone realized that there was so much more involved in creating accessible CBTs or computer-based trainings that happens behind the scenes. At first glance, it's very overwhelming to try to develop accessible CBTs. Um, the mindset focus moved from we know we have to do this to a now we know how do we actually accomplish this focus. The shift in thinking moved toward trying to answer the question, what is involved in creating an accessible e-learning project from start to finish? And once we know, how do we roll it out and implement it agency-wide?
That's great to hear. Sounds like a shift from, you know, simple compliance with a attempt to truly carry out and accomplish, the spirit of these laws and regulations. That's great to hear. So let's dive a little bit into the nerdy detail here. Can you give us some examples of obstacles, specific obstacles you had to overcome or a process you had to develop in order to ensure the accessibility of these e-learning um, products that you're producing?
Yeah. So the interactivity in computer-based trainings has often been one of the biggest obstacles that we've tackled. And to be quite honest, we're still working on it to this day. We teach our CBT developers in our CBT Train the Trainer program to be learner focused and really stress adult learning principles, and interactivity in e-learning plays a big part in making engaging training for adult learners. Um, the assumption is that in order to make accessible e-learning, we have to completely take out that interactive element that can make e-learning enjoyable. And that's not true. We just need to tweak them so that we're being inclusive of all learners. For example, a drag and drop activity is often a popular choice for e-learning developers because it engages the learner and gives them a fun way to process information. However, this interaction is dependent on a mouse. That makes it difficult for people with mobility issues who navigate only with their keyboard, or learners with a vision impairment who use a screen reader to take part in this interaction. Do we have a solid foolproof way to replace a drag and drop activity with an activity that is just as engaging? I would say we're not quite there yet, but we have brainstormed ways to break down the drag and drop activity and recreate it using other accessible features instead. I would say it's still a work in progress, as much work with accessibility is, but the more we work on it, the better it gets. And we also want our e-learning developers to think outside of the box and dream big when first putting together their ideas for a new e-learning project. Because with e-learning, the sky really is the limit. Your imagination is your limit. But we also want them to be aware and really think through what they want their learner to do as a result of the training, and then think about how they're going to accomplish it. One way we've encouraged our learners to dream big while also being conscious of accessibility is to put an emphasis on accessibility from the very beginning, before any actual development begins in our authoring tool. Before you put anything into Captivate or Articulate Storyline or whatever your tool is, we want to start with that accessibility. And that saves us a lot of time, effort, and frustration in the end, because there's less to change or fix or even completely redo.
That makes a lot of sense. So now you're not the only person developing training at DOR, correct? So how do you make sure that the training that the agency puts out is accessible, kind of no matter who does it? How do you get the consistency that you work for and operationalize that?
That's a great question. Yes, I'm definitely not the only one developing training at the Department of Revenue. We have a great team of e-learning developers in multiple divisions across the agency. Um, each of our divisions' e-learning developers is responsible for creating their division's internal and external CBTs. Employee Development Services, the unit I belong to, develops the agency's annual required training, develops for smaller divisions who do not have their own e-learning developers, provides assistance department-wide to all developers, and we also maintain our CBT accessibility process. Because we have such a vast network of e-learning developers working across the Department of Revenue, we have done a few things to operationalize our CBT accessibility. One of those things is that Employee Development Services maintains a Revenue CBT template, which we update as we learn new things or change things. We can build in some of the needed accessibility features right into the template. For example, we can preset the formatting of the closed captioning. We can set project colors to ensure compliance with color contrast standards. We can set font sizes and many other things. The template allows us to standardize the look and feel of our CBT for learners, which is a great asset in itself, but it also smooths out the accessibility process for our developers. It's kind of one less thing you have to be actively conscious about. We also recently implemented our external e-learning process. This is a roadmap for developing an external e-learning project, so a project for customers who are not internal employees. And it outlines the different phases of development that a developer is going to work through. It also has accessibility pit stops built in to check in and just ensure we're moving in the right direction. And we've heard from our CBT developers that they really like these check-in points because it helps them feel supported through the process. It also gives our developers a clear path to work through while developing those external e-learnings and keeping accessibility at the forefront throughout the entire process. We think our process is really cool. We get really nerdy about it because it means that we're thinking about accessibility from square one. We also offer a number of different trainings targeted to our CBT developers across the agency. The foundation is our CBT Train the Trainer program, which makes sure our developers are trained in instructional design principles and the basics of how to use our authoring tool. We found that we had a gap in the logistics and nuances of designing e-learning, which is where the accessibility considerations for an e-learning need to start. And our CBT Train the Trainer program strives to fill that gap to put all of our developers on even footing. From there, we have our CBT accessibility training, which builds on that foundation of our CBT Train the Trainer program and focuses on the importance of accessibility and answers that "how do I actually do accessibility in Captivate" question that most of our developers have had. We teach developers where to put the alternative text, how to adjust the reading order and the tab order, how to assess the color contrast of different items included in their trainings, among many other things. We also offer a screen reader basics class and an advanced screen reader training so that our developers are actually able to test their accessibility features they've built into their projects and ensure they're working in a way that they envisioned. We want our developers to feel comfortable addressing the most common accessibility features of e-learning on their own. But we also want them to use employee development services, including myself, as a resource during development. We have found that the accessibility process and the additional trainings that we offer have helped us work together to build more accessible e-learning content.
Well, well, I think your process is pretty cool as well. My first job actually out of college was working for an e-learning firm in Mendota Heights called Allen Interactions, and I learned a lot there about instructional design and um, how to make engaging e-learning, and it's just great to hear the work that you're doing to make sure that that learning is equally engaging for uh, folks who need to engage in different ways, whether it's through a screen reader or other tools. So it's really great information. Thank you so much, Tori, for your time on this program. And thanks to the Minnesota Department of Revenue for all their great work and ensuring you were available to join us today and help showcase that work. So thanks, Tori.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to be here.